Ready to build your Artillery Sidewinder X1? Then stick around because that's what we'll be doing in this episode. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of James Dean Designs. Now today we're going to be assembling the Artillery Sidewinder X1, and at the time of recording this is the latest model on the market, which is the V4. Now a couple of weeks ago I put a poll out and 80% of you said you had an interest in 3D printing. So like I did 12 months ago with the CNC machine, we're going to start a new series about getting into 3D printing from the point of view of a beginner. Now if you're just interested in setting the machine up, skip ahead to the timestamp on screen now, because what I'm quickly going to talk about is why I went with the Sidewinder in the first place. So when I started doing my research into 3D printing and budget-friendly machines, one of the most common suggestions that came up was the Creality X3, the X3 Pro or the X3 V2, the different variations of it. Now, I nearly clicked buy on one of those machines. But the more research I did into them, what I actually found out is they're not great machines out of the box. You need to make a lot of modifications and do a lot of upgrades to them to get them running as effectively as they can. Now this starts to create a bit of a predicament because you need the upgrades to get the machine running correctly, but you need the machine running correctly to do these upgrades. So what you potentially do is waste a lot of time just going around in circles, wasting hours printing, wasting filaments, just to try and get to a point where you're happy to use the machine. So I broadened my view a little bit, and that's when I came across the Sidewinder X1. Now it is a little bit more money, but it's ready to go out of the box, and you don't really need any tweaks or any modifications to get it running and get quality prints. So that's the reason I selected this machine. And so let's move over now and unpack it and start to get it assembled. So straight away, we can already see this is quite a large box, which as inconvenient as it is in a small workshop, what it means is that it's probably going to be well packaged and a lot of the parts are pre-assembled for you. That's why they need so much space. So let's start by cutting this open. Obviously I should warn when using the knife not to go too deep through the sellotape, just to make sure you don't damage anything underneath. Straight away we can see it is well packaged. We'll get rid of some of this packaging straight away. And take the first layer off. So my first impression is this is packed really nice. Everything's got its own place. There isn't much room for movement, which is great when things are going to be transported internationally, because everything is packed really well. Now we've got the power cable, a little bag which I assume has some tools and nuts and bolts for the assembly. We have a spare power cable depending on whether you're in the EU, the US or the UK. What I assume is the spool holder to sit on top of the machine and the little guide for it, which detects when the filament runs out. Let's dig a bit deeper. This should come out in one, I think. There we are, and that is our dual Z-axis with the X-axis. I'll just place this over here for now. Clearly I don't have enough space in this workshop. Instruction manual always comes in use when you hit difficulties at the end by not following it in the first place. Quality checklist just to show that they've gone through and made sure everything is in the box and that everything works as it should do. That's nice to have. A read me first guide, which we probably never do anyway. And then a few other bits as well with instructions. A few more bits of packaging to get out of the way. And then what I think is the final part, which is the bed assembly. Now be very careful when you're taking this out. Try not to lift it by the bed itself. Make sure that you get underneath the machine. Move the extra packaging out the way. I think at that point we can remove the box as well. There is nothing else in there. And that does have a little bit of weight in it, but it is manageable to get everything out of the box. So one thing I should say is when you're taking this out of the box, the bed does slide very easily. So make sure you don't tilt it up too much because it may run down and hit the end stops or hit your hand depending on how you're holding it. Now, if I move all this about a little bit easier, so we've got things next to each other. Straight away you can see there really isn't much to this machine to get it set up, and that's one of the things I really wanted this machine, is because it's very simple to put together. At its minimum, all we've got to do is attach this setup to the base by these holes here, and that's pretty much the machine built. Obviously we've got cables to connect and the filament holder to put on top, but it is a very simple machine to get set up. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take this piece of paper off here. Now we can see that says do not remove until the assembly has been finished. That's to protect the bed, to make sure nothing falls on it or hits it or damages it. The bed is very important on 3D printers. Next, let's take a look at what's inside the little Sidewinder X1 bag. We have a couple of spare ribbons. The ribbons are what allow the machine to run and control everything. It's nice that they provide some spares. We have another bag of what I can only assume is spares. So we've got a couple of wheels in there. I think what is the spare light, a couple of zip ties and a extra hot end. We have the spanner or the wrench, obviously to help with assembly. The USB cable for when you want to actually connect it up to a computer. Probably the most important at this phase is the bolts to assemble all this together with the Allen keys. Last but not least, the USB stick, which will contain the test file that we will try and print at the end. Let's give myself a little bit more space on here. Move the bed into the center. Now, I would probably suggest the correct way to assemble this is to put that on top of their upright that have the edge overhanging one side of the table like that, so you can put the bolts up from the underneath. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to do it slightly different. I'm going to try and tilt it on the side so you can watch as I'm assembling it. So place that on top into the position that it's meant to fit. This is quite easy, just be careful not to catch any of the cables around it. I'm just going to quickly spin this around and then tilt it over onto the side. Now we'll take the 4 M5 40mm bolts, and they should go in fairly easy. Just put them in with your fingers to begin with. And then take the Allen key and tighten them up. Now you just want to start to pinch them, don't take them all the way just yet. And once we've got them all more or less there, we will then come back and tighten them all up. So while we're still looking at the back of the machine, we're going to get the spool holder fitted, and there should be 4 nuts already sitting in the channel of the aluminium extrusion. Now while I'm here, I should mention what's good about this machine is that it's got dual Z axis. What's great about it is that they are linked together, and what this means is they move simultaneously, and it minimises any risk of them being out of kilter and not perfectly in a line. Now with the spool holder, what you will want is the thicker end overhanging the back and the thinner end overhanging the front. The one side does have the filament guide, so be careful not to knock that when you're doing things, and we will connect this up shortly. So if you just place that roughly in position, take one of the nuts and just put that in initially to hold it. We'll do the same with the other side. Now at this point it doesn't matter how far away they are, because we'll come back and adjust them later to the width of your spool. Let's pull these apart slightly. Move the T-nuts back into position, and then we'll just get the other bolts put in place. Now the instructions show the filament guide cable being attached from the side. However, on this model, it appears the connection is on the top. So we're just going to slide this up and through and then connect it via the top port here. Should just click into place. So with everything structural in place, our quick guide, which I've only just realised is all in German, tells us to start connecting the different cables. Now there are a couple of different types of connections on this machine. The majority are quite easy, like the filament connection that we just did, which is a pre-crimped plastic connector that can only go in one way. The other connections, which are for the different axes, they will be ribbon connections or flexible flat cable connections. And that's what was in the spare pack that we took out of the bag earlier. Now do be careful when making these connections. They just push in with a bit of compression. Don't put too much effort in. Don't try and put them in at an angle. Put them in parallel and slide them in easy. There is a guide sheet that comes with it just to advise you on how to do this. But as I say, be very careful with this next step. Now all of the cables come taped down obviously for transportation purposes, and the first connection we're going to make is to the Z limit switch, which is placed just under here. On older models this may be separate and already connected to this cable and you just have to manually fit it yourself, but on the V4 it comes pre-inserted and to the correct height. So we'll just untape these now and connect the Z limit switch up. So I've spun the machine around. I'm just going to show you the other connection that we make while we're in this area. And that is for one of the Z stepper motors on the right hand side. That should just push into there and click. Next we'll do the same on the opposite side. We've got two connections here, again for the other Z stepper motor axis, and one over here which is the opposite end to the filament guide that we connected earlier. So we'll take the tape off and we'll connect the Z motor first. You should just be able to turn this round. It is a bit of a tight fit, but it should just about connect. Obviously it's slightly difficult doing this one-handed for the camera. And then we've got the other one which says for the filament guide. Bring this over here, and again that should just drop into place. Now one of the reasons they don't give you too much access cable is because obviously the bed slides back and forth, so they like to keep the cables quite tight and out of the way. If we're moving this, the guard has come out of it, just make sure you push it all back into place. The next step is to connect the ribbons or the flexible flat cables. One has already been done for us, but before we go ahead and do the others, we're just going to remove these zip ties holding the assembly in place. So use a pair of snips and do be very careful not to catch anything that you shouldn't. Also be cautious when pulling it out of position that you don't catch anything as well. Now with those out the way, it allows this to move up and down a bit freely. And we have two connections that we need to make. One is underneath here and one is on the side there. So I'm just going to raise this up a little bit more to get access to the one under here, but first I'm going to remove all the remaining pieces of tape holding the cable in place. I have just also realised there's another stepper motor cable I need to connect here. I might as well do that while I'm in position. And again that just clips into place nice and easy. Remove the tape on the end over here as well for the other ribbon. So I'm going to raise this up first, just pull it up gently. It should take a little bit of pressure but not too much. And then we're going to undo the tape on this last ribbon connection down here. So just simply bend this forward and you'll see there is a blue piece of plastic on the back of it. Using your finger and your thumb, insert this vertically but evenly into the slot, line it up, and then put pressure down to insert it all the way in. And we'll do the same with this ribbon, again keeping it even, line it up with the slot, and then just push it in. So at this point we need to go around and take a look at the eccentric nuts. If you're not familiar with what these are, wherever you have a setup like this with the rollers, typically the one that is on its own will be the eccentric nut. And what that means is depending on how you turn the nut behind it, whether it goes left or right, it will either tighten or release the amount of pressure on this particular gantry. Now you've got one on the X, you've got two on the Z, and there is also another one underneath the bed for the Y axis. If you're not familiar with how they actually work, if you imagine this being the bolt, rather than the hole being dead center, it is offset to one side. So as you turn it, it will either apply or release the pressure depending on whether it is on the thicker area or the thinner area. And that's exactly how these gain traction on the rails. Now, I'm not sure if I'm fortunate or Artillery have done a much better job of setting these up, but there doesn't seem to be any slipping. As I rotate the wheel, it is moving the carriage and there's not too much pressure. And as I say, it's not slipping either. And this appears to be the same on the X-axis. There's no slipping with it. I can rotate these, but I can't move it. So it does appear to be in good shape. Now, if you do need to adjust them, you take the spanner or the wrench that came with the kit, and there is a little nut at the back of here to put it in place. And as I say, depending on where that nut is sitting, you will either loosen or tighten the amount of tension by moving it left or right. And as I say, that will adjust the width between these rollers. The nuts underneath the bed or on the Y-axis are a little bit more difficult to access. However, there should just about be enough room to get your wrench or spanner in, access the nut, and then adjust it as you need to. So as for the machine, that is everything set up. What we're going to do now is take off this little cover, move that out of the way, get the power connected, and then start to take a look at the interface and getting the bed leveled. Now the next step is critical to getting a good 3D print. What we're going to do is level up the bed, and basically what this means is we're going to make sure the height between the top of the bed and the tip of the nozzle on the hot end is consistent no matter where the head is in relation to the bed. Now again, another thing I like about the Sidewinder is these adjusters are already in place. You don't need to do them as an upgrade. But one thing we do need to do is make sure that everything is preheated before we start to calibrate or do this leveling up test. And the reason we preheat everything, as everything heats up and expands, obviously it will change the shape and dimension of everything. So there's no point in doing a leveling test while it's cold. So now we'll take a closer look at the menu and the interaction on this screen and start to get everything heated up. So when you start the machine up, this is the screen that you'll be presented with. Now you will see straight away we have the nozzle on the left and the bed on the right. The first number is the temperature that it's currently at. The number after the / is the temperature we're going to set it, or we will expect it to rise to. It's currently set at 0 because we're not preheating anything up. On the right hand side we have the fan and the power that that's currently running at. Again, it's not running, so it's at 0. So the first thing we want to do is start to get everything to preheat. So we're going to the tools menu and we'll click on the heat option. Now what we can see here is it's currently set to the extrude nozzle. As we say, it's at 11 degrees and we want to take this up to around about 190, something like that. You can change the amount you increase the temperature with this button here. So as we press it, it goes from 1 to 5 to 10. So we'll leave it on 10 because we want to jump it up quite a bit to begin with. So we'll go add. And as you can see, as we're pressing add, the number on the right hand side is also going up at the same time. So we'll take this up to around about 190 to begin with. There we are, it's 190. And as we watch it, this will slowly start to increase till the temperature gets to the 190 that we've set it to. The next thing we want to do is to preheat the bed. So if we press the extrude, it will change over to the bed symbol. Again, it's at 17 degrees and we want to take this up to, I don't know, around about 60 degrees, 70 degrees. So we'll go add. I'll take it up to 70 degrees to begin with. Now this gets up to temperature really quick. It didn't take long at all to reach the temperatures that we set. So there we can see it will probably just fluctuate between 69 and 71, something like that. And we'll go back to the nozzle. And again, that's at 190. So what we'll do now is we're just going to quickly run the homing sequence before we start doing the leveling setup. So we'll come back out to the tools menu and we'll go to home. Now, if you're not familiar with homing, on every axis there is a sensor. We talked about the one on the Z-axis earlier on, and this is to stop the head from hitting the bed. Now every axis has one, and basically what it allows the machine to do is know a defined point of where it can start a job from. What we can do here is run each axis individually by selecting them, or we can run it all together as one. And what it will just do is run a sequence where it touches each sensor on each axis until it knows where to start or where the 0 point is. So we'll click that now. It does run this process quite quickly, it only takes a few seconds. Now that's really important because, as we spoke about earlier with the Z-axis, the top of the nozzle shouldn't touch the bed, so that sensor should be set at a point where it just clears the bed itself. The next step is we'll start to run the leveling process. So if we come out again back to the main tools menu and we go to the level option, now what you can see is it divides the bed up into 5 sections, which is basically each corner and then the 5th area, which is the centre of the bed. And we will do each one individually now. We'll start by pressing the first corner. So the camera should just about pick up there is a small amount of gap below the nozzle, and what we're going to do is simply slide a piece of paper back and forth whilst adjusting this knob until we start to feel the resistance of the nozzle itself on the paper. So as we turn this slowly, get that back under there, and keep sliding this back and forth. Now if you can hear that, you can start to just hear it scraping across the paper, and then you can see the resistance there. As I started to push it back, it was crumpling a little bit. That's the level that we're aiming for, so there's a bit of drag on it, but not too much because it can still move. And we'll repeat that process on every point. So once you've done the process once, you will want to do it again, because as you adjust each corner, it will throw the level of the bed off. And what you're aiming for is, once each corner is done accurately, the centre one should be the same as every other one, even though there's no adjustment for that. So hopefully that went really smooth for you. And what I'd actually forgotten is that when you run the leveling sequence, it homes automatically at the start. So there was no need to do it in the step before that. Now, what the camera didn't really pick up is that when I was doing that paper test, on the 5th location, the centre where it is now, there was a little bit of extra gap and I couldn't figure out why. I'd do all 4 corners, test it, there'd be a bit of drag, go back to the middle, and it was really loose. What I actually realised, there was a very slight bow in the bed. Now, due to the nature of these beds and the way they heat up and the different elements within them, this can happen. If yours is the same, what you need to do to alleviate the problem is put a few heat cycles through it. So take the temperature of the bed up to 80 degrees, let it get all the way up to temperature, then bring it back down to 0 and let it cool all the way back down. Do this about 8 to 10 times and you should find that the bed then levels out nice and flat. The other thing to mention is that if your tip is more than a couple of millimeters above the bed when you're doing the leveling sequence, you may want to adjust your Z limit switch on the opposite side over there. Just bring that down a little bit so that the tip is close to the bed when you're doing your leveling sequence, because you don't really want to put too much tension on the springs underneath. So during this video, I did have a slight issue with one of the sensors. It was actually the one on the Y, but when I came to take the Z sensor off, what I noticed is they no longer are variable in the height. There is a hole already preset for the correct height. Now what they do is provide you with a bolt and a hammer nut so that you can swap these over if for any reason you do need to adjust the height of the sensor. Now with all that out the way, let's move on to getting the spool in place and starting to feed some filament through. So the printer doesn't actually come with any filament. You need to purchase your own to get started. Now there are different thicknesses and compositions available on the market, but to keep this simple, as it is a beginner's guide, we're going to be using PLA 1.75mm thick. It's probably the safest starting option with this machine. Now equally as important as the type of filament is the manufacturer you get it from. There are lots of different available, but when I asked for recommendations, 3 names regularly came up. Now the first is Amazon Basics, obviously globally available, so that is brilliant and reasonably priced. The second name that came up was 3DQF. Now these are a bit more environmentally friendly. Their spools are on cardboard. They do some nice colours. I've got a bright green here and the prices are very reasonable. The most recommended product was Erion, and I also brought a spool of theirs. conveniently in a nice bright orange colour. Now these were a little bit more expensive, but as I say, it was the most recommended product. It's also worth pointing out that all the details about the filament itself is printed on the spools should you ever need to reference it for the working temperatures. Now you will notice both of these spools come in a vacuum sealed bag with a silica sachet inside. It's really important to keep the filament dry and away from moisture whenever you're storing it. Now, all the recommended products will be linked in the description below if you want to find them. But for now, let's get this spool installed and start to feed it through into the hot end. So after unpacking your filament, I would suggest using a sharp pair of snips just to take off any kinks or blobs that may be on the end of the filament. You also want to make sure that your holder is the correct width for your spool. So just adjust the bolts at the back, widen it or tighten it so that your spool sits nicely on the bearings. So we'll place this in position now. Just make sure it rotates freely. Feed the filament through the guide here. That should just push into the hole and out the bottom. As we've done that, there is a little blue light that lights up inside just to say it is detecting the filament. We'll pull this all the way down, place it in the hole there, just pull back the clamp mechanism and slide that through as far as it will go. Now, when this goes through the quality checking process, they do a test print with it, so you may find that you already have some filament in place. Now, with that in position, what we're going to do is come to the menu, press the change button, and then press the in button. Now, what it should do is preheat that up, pull the filament through and push through any old filament that's already in there. So it can take a second for the machine to heat everything up, so we will give this a few seconds and I'll speed it up when it is starting to do the process. So as this is a beginner's guide, I thought it'd be good to give a quick overview of how the hot end setup works. So as your filament comes in, this applies a bit of pressure to the mechanism and this allows it to be pulled through into the center of this setup. Within there, it will get heated up. Obviously, this makes it more malleable, but more importantly, it gives it better adhesion properties, which helps obviously to make it stick to the bed and build up the layers as it's printing. This fan on the side just helps to regulate the temperature of the hot end setup. Underneath, you have the hot end tip where the filament actually comes out. Obviously, at that point, it is very soft and flexible. This fan here helps to cool everything down at that stage in order to make sure that it's not too floppy and flexible when it's on the bed and being built up. So in short, basically what happens is it comes in, it gets very hot, gets pumped out and cooled down at the same time. So now we're at the exciting part where we get to do our first test print. We're going to use the USB stick that came with the device, so we'll simply insert that into the USB port. On the menu, let's go back to the very start. Obviously, within the menu, there are lots of settings that you can go in and look at, but for the purpose of this being a beginner's tutorial, I'm just focusing on what we need to do. We're then going to go into print, and we can see that it's detected the USB drive. We'll select that, and it loads up the cube. This is the only file on there, so we will select that. And it'll ask confirmation of do we want to start the job. Now obviously what should happen is it will heat everything up, home the device, and then start to print the cube somewhere in the middle of the bed. So let's get started with this. Obviously it'll take a little time for everything to heat up, so we'll speed this up and come back in a few seconds. Now what I'll point out at this stage, you should see that the LED reflection, the colour of it is changing underneath there. The different colours represent different stages of the bed getting ready for temperature and the hot end getting up to temperature as well. When it's ready to print, it should go to the beginning of the bed, change to white and start doing all the printing. This thing really is super quiet. You can hardly hear it running. It has a couple of fast moments when it moves from position to position, but this really is super quiet. So there we have it, our first print fresh off the bed. Now, at a glance, I'm really happy with the quality of that, considering we've barely done any setup with this machine. Let's pop it off and take a closer look. I've got a little bit of a lip that we're going to have to take off the bottom, which that should just pop off. Yeah, nice and easy. But there is our first cube. The layers are so neat and crisp and uniform on this. I really am impressed for a first print. So after doing one test cube, I went ahead and printed a second one just to make sure it wasn't a lucky run, and they both came out perfect. I was so confident at that point that my third test run is this 3D spiralised vase that's currently printing at the moment, and it looks amazing. It really does. The quality of it is so smooth, and I'm really happy with how it's coming out. Now, what I will try and do is put some test files in the description area for you, so you don't always have to rely on the standard cubes. Do check out the description area. It's where I put all the useful information about the machine, where you can purchase it from. I also put a link to the Patreon page if you want to support this channel. Now, we've done a test print, we've set the machine up and built it, and everything is going smooth. So that pretty much does wrap this episode up. As I said at the start, I am a beginner to 3D printing, so if I've done something wrong, you think I can improve something, then please do chat with me in the comments section below. I honestly love talking to everybody. But that is the end of this episode, and I will see you all on the next one.